These are the worst punishments in ancient Egypt. Beating. You're a soldier marching home through a farming village, and you've decided a farmer's stack of cowhides would look a lot better in your camp than in his storeroom. So you take them. Nobody stops you because nobody argues with a soldier, but somebody remembers your face, walks into a court, and reports you. Now you're lying face down in the dirt with a man pulling at your ankles so the soles of your feet point straight up, while a scribe reads out your sentence. Your sentence is the bastinado, which is just a fancy word for getting beaten on the feet with a stick. In ancient Egypt, it was the punishment for almost anything that wasn't serious enough to get you killed. Theft, dodging state labor, lying to officials, and cheating on taxes could all end the same way. The number of strokes was decided before the first blow landed and written into the record by the scribe. After that, all anyone had to do was count. We know the exact numbers because the pharaohs carved them into stone more than once. Around 1319 BC, a general named Horemheb took the throne and discovered that his own officials were robbing ordinary people blind. His solution was to carve a legal decree at Karnak, the massive temple complex at Thebes, Egypt's religious capital in the south, listing different crimes and exactly what each one earned you. Your crime is on there almost word for word. A soldier caught stealing hides gets 100 blows and 5 open wounds. A generation later, Seti I, the father of Ramses the Great, carved another decree into a cliff face at Nauri in Nubia, the land directly south of Egypt. He'd built a lavish temple at Abydos, the sacred city of Osiris, god of the dead. The decree was meant to protect it. Anyone caught interfering with the temple's people or property got 100 blows and 5 open wounds. And for the worst offenses, the count ran as high as 200. Once the counting starts, the rod comes down across the soles of your feet, over and over. The skin there is some of the thickest on your body, and it's anchored tightly to the tissue underneath, so it can't slide out of the way the skin on your back can. It's also packed with more nerve endings than almost anywhere else. Every blow lands on the plantar fascia, the thick band of tissue running from your heel to your toes that supports your arch. Modern doctors who've scanned the feet of people beaten this way have found that fascia thickened and scarred years afterward. By the time it's over, your feet are so swollen that walking home becomes part of the punishment. Then comes the 5 open wounds. Someone steps forward with a knife and cuts you 5 separate times, deep enough to scar. Bruises disappear after a few weeks, but 5 matching scars would stay with you for life. Every neighbor, merchant, and official who saw them would know exactly what you've been convicted of without anybody saying a word. Beating the soles of the feet as a punishment outlived the pharaohs, passed through Greek and Roman Egypt, and carried on under a new name, the falaka, which the Ottoman Empire was still using on criminals and schoolboys well into the 1800s. Reports of it even turned up in parts of the Middle East as late as the 20th century. Cutting off the nose. You're an official collecting taxes along the Nile when you spot a poor farmer pulling a boat loaded with goods down the river. You decide you'd rather have the boat yourself, so you seize it, take everything stacked on it, and send the farmer away with nothing. He reports you, you get arrested, dragged before a magistrate, and held there while soldiers pin your arms. Then one of them steps forward with a blade and slowly raises it toward the middle of your face. Your punishment is nose amputation. And the first time we actually see it written into Egyptian law is in that same decree Pharaoh Horemheb set up at Karnak to stop officials from preying on people too poor to fight back. One part describes your crime almost exactly. It clearly states that if an official seizes a poor man's boat and its cargo for himself, his nose is cut off, and he's sent to a place called Tajaru. The blade takes your nose clean off, cartilage and all, and the wound heals into a flat, scarred hole right in the center of your face. After that, you can go right back to making yourself useful to society, only you'd be doing it somewhere new. That was actually the point of aiming for the nose. Your hands still work, and your legs still work, so the crown can keep using you for labor, but the mark sits in the middle of your face where you can't hide it, explain it away as an accident, or ever grow it back. Once the wound healed, they marched you to Tajaru, a mud brick fortress on Egypt's eastern frontier. It was the last major stronghold before the desert route into Sinai, about as far from your old life as the government could reasonably send you while still putting you to work. Egypt sent enough noseless men down that road that centuries later, Greek writers were describing a border settlement called Rhinokorura, which literally means cut off noses, forced labor in the mines. You're a career thief who finally pushed your luck too far. The first time they caught you stealing, you got a beating and went home limping. This time you were caught hauling away grain that belonged to the pharaoh himself. The magistrate decides the rod hasn't taught you a thing. Now you're chained into a line of prisoners marching east before sunrise. The last strip of green along the Nile has already disappeared behind you. You've been sentenced to the mines. And in ancient Egypt, that was a slow death disguised as a job. Egypt ran on gold. It paid officials, filled royal tombs, and bought foreign allies. And most of it came from the mines buried deep in the eastern desert and Nubia. The problem was that almost nobody volunteered to work there. The mines sat in some of the hottest, driest areas Egypt controlled. So the crown found another workforce instead. Convicts like you, prisoners of war, and sometimes even the wives and children of accused criminals. Egyptian texts were already threatening people with hard labor in Nubia back in the New Kingdom, the roughly 5-century stretch when Egypt was at the height of its power. So the sentence itself is as old as the pharaohs. The most detailed account we have, though, comes from much later, when Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that took over after Alexander the Great died and ruled the country for nearly 3 centuries, right down to Cleopatra. They needed gold to pay their armies, so they opened dozens of mines in the mountains between the Nile and the Red Sea. Out there, the galleries follow the quartz veins underground and are often too low to stand up in, and every drop of water has to be hauled in or drawn from a single well the camp was built around. The powder coming out the grinding stones is crushed quartz, which is silica, and breathing it in day after day scars the lungs permanently. It's one of the oldest occupational hazards in human history, and nobody working those stones had any idea it was happening. A Greek historian named Diodorus Siculus wrote the whole system down around 60 BC. He wasn't describing something he'd seen himself, though. He was relying on an earlier account by Agatharchides, a Greek scholar working in Alexandria about a century before him, who, by most accounts, never went anywhere near a mine either. To put it simply, the fullest description of Egyptian gold mining we have is a Greek quoting another Greek, neither of whom seems to have actually visited a mine. Even so, it's detailed enough to follow the work from one pair of hands to the next. The strongest prisoners hacked away at the gold-bearing rock with iron picks. Boys squeezed into the tight spaces behind them and dragged the broken stone back out. Older men smashed it into smaller pieces. Then women and elderly prisoners ground it into powder until the tiny specks of gold could finally be washed free. According to Diodorus, the whole chain worked under the whip. Nobody stopped because they were sick. Nobody stopped because they were old. And if someone collapsed, the work kept moving around them. Now, how much of that is actually true has been up for debate for decades, because when archaeologists finally excavated one of these mines, they found things that didn't quite line up with Diodorus' account. At a Ptolemaic gold mine called Gaza in the eastern desert, a French team uncovered an entire village with streets, houses, administrative buildings, and even baths. They also found hundreds of ostraka, broken pottery people wrote on because papyrus was expensive, recording wages paid to miners. There were no guarded barracks anywhere in sight, so for the first few seasons of excavation, Gaza looked less like a death camp and more like a rough mining town where people showed up, got paid, and did an absolutely miserable job. Then, in 2023, they found the shackles. 2 complete sets of heavy iron ankle cuffs turned up in a Gaza storeroom alongside tools and mining waste. They were built to lock around human ankles and are almost identical to shackles found at Lorion, the famous Greek silver mines outside Athens, which means somebody shipped the restraint design to Egypt right along with the mining techniques. Exile. You're a middle-class farmer in ancient Egypt arguing with a royal tax collector over this year's harvest. The number he wrote down is way higher than your fields actually produced. You call him a liar. He tells you to watch your mouth. One shove becomes a fight. And before it's over, you've beaten one of the pharaoh's officials bloody in front of a crowd. The court could have executed you for that, but instead the magistrate decides to spare your life and remove you from Egypt altogether. So now you're walking out under armed guard, past the last green field at the edge of the valley, into open sand. This is banishment. And to an Egyptian, it landed one short step from a death sentence. The average Egyptian built his whole existence around 3 things: the Nile that flooded his fields and fed him, the plot of land his family had worked for generations, and the tomb he was slowly cutting and stocking for the day he died. The tomb mattered most of all, because a proper burial on home soil was the thing that carried you into the afterlife. Banishment stripped away all three of those things at once and left you with nothing. Egyptians barely thought of the world past their own border as a real place a person could live. It was where you went to be forgotten. The courts had a few places they could dump you. One was Kush, a conquered territory along the Nile deep in Nubia. Convicts were marched down to a chain of mud brick forts scattered throughout the region, where the garrison would put you to work hauling stone, digging canals, and loading grain. And they wouldn't even bother chaining you up at night. If you ran, you'd have to cross hundreds of miles of open desert on foot with no water and no shelter. So, long story short, you wouldn't get very far. The other option was the Great Oasis, a patch of green sitting by itself in the western desert with days of empty sand between it and the nearest Egyptian town. Egyptians talked about the place the way you'd talk about the far side of the moon. One surviving text, the Tale of Woe, is written as a letter from a man exiled there, and he describes the oasis as the place where his life effectively ended. We know for sure that at least one group of men got sent out there, because someone carved the whole story into stone. Around 1050 BC, after a revolt broke out in Thebes, the ringleaders were brought before Amun, Egypt's chief god, for judgment. The priest carried his shrine through the temple courtyard, asked whether the rebels should be exiled, and read the answer from the way the sacred boat moved. Forward meant yes. Backward meant no. That was the verdict. Hard to appeal when your judge is a god. The boat moved, and the rebels were marched west into the desert. They stayed there for years until a new high priest, Menkhepere, stood before the same shrine and asked Amun a different question. Should they be allowed home? This time, the answer was yes. The survivors made the long walk back into the Nile Valley, and Menkhepere had the whole episode carved into a stone monument. Around 1860, a French consular agent picked it up at Luxor, the modern town built over ancient Thebes, and today it's sitting in the Louvre, where it's known as the Banishment Stela. Forced self-killing. You're a palace official, and a few months ago you made the worst decision of your life. A group inside the royal court approached you with a plan to assassinate Pharaoh Ramesses III and replace him with his son, Prince Pentuer. You agreed to help. The assassination succeeded, but the coup didn't. The rightful heir seized control before the conspirators could, rounded everyone up, and put you on trial. The verdict catches you completely off guard. The court doesn't send you off to be beaten, mutilated, or impaled. Instead, guards escort you into a private room, close the door behind you, and leave you alone with exactly one job. You have to self-delete, a punishment Egypt sometimes reserved for its highest-ranking offenders. The best-known cases come from what's now called the Harem Conspiracy, one of the biggest palace coup attempts in ancient Egyptian history. We know about it because the entire trial was recorded in a document called the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, named after the Italian city where it's kept today. It's basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of court records, just with a lot more palace drama. And the document has one deeply strange feature. It opens with Ramesses III himself speaking, appointing the judges and ordering the investigation, even though a related papyrus calls him the Great God, a title Egyptians only gave to kings who were already dead. In other words, his son ran the whole trial in his murdered father's name. It all started with Ramesses III's secondary wife, Tiye. She wanted her son, Prince Pentuer, on the throne instead of the rightful heir, so she put together a conspiracy to murder the pharaoh. Palace officials signed on. Military officials signed on. Servants and women from inside the royal harem signed on. They even recruited royal magicians, who made wax figures meant to curse the king and weaken his guards. More than 40 people ended up named in the court record, so by the end it was less of a secret plot and more of a palace group project. For thousands of years, all anyone knew was that the conspiracy had happened. Then, researchers CT scanned Ramesses III's mummy in 2012 and found something nobody had noticed before. Hidden beneath the linen wrappings was a deep slash across his throat, cut all the way to the bone. So, phase 1 of the plan actually worked. Ramesses III really was murdered. The problem for the conspirators was everything that came after. The court sorted the guilty by rank. 28 of them were sent to death and executed, though the scribes never bothered to record exactly how. Another 10, including Prince Pentuer, were allowed to take their own lives instead. Not because the court felt sorry for them, they just weren't about to publicly execute members of the royal family because it would have looked bad, and appearances counted for a lot in ancient Egypt. Even the judges weren't safe. While the case was still underway, several men, including judges from the panel, were caught drinking and carrying on with some of the accused harem women. The court wasted no time turning on its own. 4 of them had their noses and ears cut off, and 1 more escaped with a scolding. Seizing the household. You're a herdsman on a temple estate, and every animal in your care belongs to the god. Your job is to feed them, count them, and hand one over whenever the priests need one for the altar. Instead, you've spent the last 2 seasons quietly selling a few here and there and pocketing the money. Eventually, someone catches onto you and turns you in. Now you're standing before a magistrate while he reads out your sentence. As he speaks, a group of officials head toward your house. They're not going there to search it. They're going to empty it. What you're facing is total confiscation. And in ancient Egypt, it reached a lot further than your furniture and livestock. A free man wasn't just an individual in the eyes of the law. He was the head of a household, and everything under his authority, his land, grain, cattle, even his family, formed a single legal unit. So when the state moved to destroy a man, it didn't have to stop at the man. It could take that whole unit apart and fold every piece of it into the temple he'd robbed. When they arrive at your house, the scribes get to work immediately. They count the grain in your stores and the cattle in your pen. They measure the land your family has farmed for generations. And then they count your wife and your children the exact same way, as items on a list. By the time they are finished, every last item on that list has been transferred to the temple you stole from. For your family, this is only the beginning. Egypt's temples were the largest landholders in the country. They ran enormous estates that depended on thousands of workers. Your wife and children are now part of that workforce for the rest of their lives. And going by how temple servitude generally worked, any children born to them afterward would inherit the same status. The sentence comes straight from Seti I's decree at Nauri, the one protecting his temple at Abydos. It specifically names the temple's herdsmen and cattle keepers, the men trusted with the god's own livestock, and says betraying that trust in either of 2 ways, selling the animals or letting them be sacrificed to any god other than Osiris, meant losing your wife, your children, and everything you owned to the temple. As for you, the decree had something else in store. Impalement. You're the temple herdsman who got caught selling off cattle that belonged to the gods and keeping the money for yourself. The first half of your sentence has already been concluded. Your wife, your children, and everything you own have been counted, listed, and handed over to the temple you stole from. Now it's time for phase 2. Guards are marching you across an open field toward a sharpened wooden stake planted upright in the ground. This is impalement, the punishment Egypt reserved for the gravest of sins, and selling the god's own cattle counted as one of them. A crime against a temple was more than just ordinary theft. The estate, the grain, and every animal in that herd were the personal property of a god. So a herdsman who sold them off was thought to be robbing heaven itself. An attack on the gods was an attack on the order that held the whole world together, which is why the punishment had to be something people remembered long after they watched it happen. The Egyptians had a name for what came next. They called it being placed on the wood. Guards lifted the condemned onto the sharpened stake, then gravity did almost all the work. As the body slowly slid downward under its own weight, the stake worked its way upward through the body along the path of least resistance. Death usually came hours later, from blood loss, shock, and massive internal injuries, while the victim remained upright in full view of everyone passing by. We know impalement as a mode of punishment wasn't just something people made up, because it shows up in Egyptian records themselves. Seti I ordered it for corrupt herdsmen in the decree he carved at Nari, and the punishment turns up again in judicial documents from the end of the New Kingdom, where people even swore oaths on pain of the stake. Surprisingly, in a civilization that carved absolutely everything onto its walls, there are no drawings of the act anywhere in Egyptian art. 3,000 years of painters and sculptors, and not one of them ever put it in a scene. What survives is a single small hieroglyph tucked into the written verdicts. It shows a human figure stretched out on a stake. Burning. You're a temple robber in ancient Egypt, and business has been good. For months, you and your crew have been slipping into temples after dark, stripping gold off shrines, hauling away sacred statues, and disappearing before anyone knows what's happened. Then one night, you push your luck too far. The priests report the theft. The crown tracks you down. and now soldiers are marching you toward a pile of stacked firewood while one of them reaches for a torch. You've just been sentenced to death by fire. And to an Egyptian, this particular punishment does something far worse than just kill you. Ancient Egyptians spent 70 days turning their dead into mummies. Roughly half that time was spent packing the body in natron, a naturally occurring salt that pulled the moisture out of the flesh. The rest went on washing, anointing the body with oils, and wrapping it in linen. They took those 70 days so seriously that when certain stars disappeared from the sky for about the same length of time, Egyptian texts explained it by saying the stars were off being embalmed like everyone else. All of that work was to protect the interests of a part you called the Ba. Egyptians believed a person was made up of several parts, and the Ba was the one that carried your personality. They pictured it as a bird with a human head. During the day, it could leave the tomb and go wherever it liked, but every night it had to come back and settle onto the body it belonged to, and it had to recognize that body. So the corpse had to still be there, still intact, and still look like you. Fire destroyed the one thing the whole system depended on, the body itself. A corpse burned to ash couldn't be packed in natron, wrapped in linen, or laid in a coffin. There'd be no mummy for the Ba to return to, and no body it could ever recognize as you. Your afterlife ended before it even began. That's why burning was reserved for the people the state wanted erased, rather than merely dead, like rebels, traitors, and temple robbers. It appears as a sentence in New Kingdom records, turns up again in later ones, and Egyptian stories regularly send their worst criminals into the flames, so the fear of it ran through the culture for centuries. Erasing the name. You're standing before the court that just convicted you of plotting against the pharaoh. And the scribe recording your sentence does something strange. He doesn't write down your real name. He writes Mesed Sura instead, meaning Ra hates him. Ra was Egypt's sun god, and the pharaoh himself was known as the son of Ra. So the scribe isn't just insulting you. He's officially recording you as a man the gods despise, and that's the name that follows you through the rest of the record. This is name erasure, and to an Egyptian, it was a way of executing someone all over again. Egyptians believed your name was a working part of you, just like your body. For you to keep existing after death, somebody had to keep saying it, reading it, or writing it. That's why tomb walls are covered in their owner's name, and why families returned to offering chapels year after year to speak it out loud. One of the kindest things you could wish for an ancient Egyptian was that his name would endure. Which means the opposite was also true. If every copy of a man's name could be found and destroyed, he could be killed a second time. The court that tried the killers of Ramesses III used exactly that as a sentence. The scribes went through the trial record and rewrote the names of many of the accused into insults one at a time. So the very document that preserved those people for 3,000 years is also the one that refuses to tell us who most of them really were. Pharaohs did the same thing to each other, just on a much bigger scale. Akhenaten, the king who shut down Egypt's traditional gods and ordered everyone to worship the sun itself, got the treatment after he died. His successors demolished his temples and chiseled his name off everything they could reach. About a century later, the same thing happened to Hatshepsut, one of the few women to rule as pharaoh, when her successor had her name scrubbed from monuments and dropped her from the record. For a while, people assumed he'd smashed the faces off her statues too as a part of his revenge. But a 2025 study of the old excavation records showed the statues were snapped cleanly at the neck, waist, and knees, which is how Egyptians ritually retired royal statues. The faces were left alone. Whoever did it was after her name, and only her name. You can still see the damage today. Cartouches, the oval rings that enclose the royal name, have been hammered flat into bare stone all over Egypt. Some pharaohs were erased from the official king lists so completely that an Egyptian reading them 2 centuries later would have had no idea they'd ever ruled. And in 1907, an excavation in the Valley of Kings, the royal burial ground across the river from Thebes, opened a tomb known as KV-55 and found a gilded coffin lying inside. Someone in ancient times had torn the gold face off of it and cut the owner's name out of the lid, the gold band running down the body, and the prayer across the foot. It worked. More than a century later, archaeologists still can't say for certain who's lying inside.